guys, it's Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm actually kidding. I'm Ted Bundy. Today we are talking about plasma cutters and if it's worth it for you to buy one. About a year and a half ago, I wanted to get a plasma cutter. So I went to the store and I got this CutSkill 60. This is a 60 amp plasma cutter and this one can cut about 26 mil plate, which is massive. I also got a 60 liter air compressor. So there's a million ways to cut metal, from plasma cutters to porta bands to oxyacetylene to angle grinders to metal cutting circular saws, etc, etc, etc. At the time I thought a plasma cutter was going to be the solution to all of my problems, but I was sadly mistaken. Plasma cutters have some clear-cut advantages. The first one is you can cut pretty thick material. The second one is the gun reaches into tight spaces, so if you need to cut a bolt or something or work on a vehicle, it's pretty easy to do. Plasma cutters can cut non-ferrous metals such as aluminium, which many methods of cutting steel can't do. Plasma cutters can also run far cheaper than oxyacetylene, which is a clear advantage if you're cutting a lot of material. With a plasma cutter, you can also cut in any direction. You aren't limited by the curve of a disc or a blade. With all of that said though, I don't think plasma cutters are as great of an option as many people make them out to be. In this video, I'm going to be comparing plasma cutters to one of my favorite tools of all time, angle grinders. This is a Bosch Green 9-inch angle grinder. The reason why I'm going to compare these two very different tools together is because you really can't get that far without an angle grinder. You're going to need one anyway. So it's not really at any increase in cost to you to just use an angle grinder to cut something. And an angle grinder is something I can confidently say that pretty much everyone watching this video has. My main issue with plasma cutters is they take so long to set up. Because I have a pretty limited space here, I keep the ground clamp and the gun in a drawer here and I just keep the machine standing by itself. So if I want to set it up, I've got to take everything out and plug it in. Not to mention, I have to carry this outside or wheel it out on my cart, and then I have to hook it up with my air compressor and make sure my air compressor is running. Then I have to untangle my hose that's outside and then connect it to this, make sure it's at the right pressure, and then I can finally make one cut. Whereas if I just grab something like an angle grinder, bam, and I'm there to cutting, I can just take this off and then I'm cutting already. So you can see how much of a hassle it is using a plasma cutter. Not to mention the cost of plasma cutters. This one's a 60 amp. Most plasma cutters are, I think, 40 or 50 amps. But they'll be probably at least $800 if you get a decent one. There are people who get far cheaper plasma cutters, but I would never suggest that. Now, let's talk about cost. Plasma cutters cost a lot of money for a lot of reasons. The first one is just the machine. I think this one retails for about $1,300, but this is a 60 amp one, and it's 60 true amps. Most plasma cutters are between, I think, 35 and 50 amps. If you get the cheaper ones, they'll probably say they're 50 amps, but actually be probably closer to 30. Anyway, you're looking at about $800 or more if you're looking at a decent one. This was about $1,300. And that's not including the air compressor that you're going to have to get, and all the accessories and hoses and fittings that you need for the air compressor. On top of this, you need all the fittings for the gun on the plasma cutter, and they can get pretty damn expensive. My setup here cost, I think, about $2,500, which is a lot of coin to spend on just one sort of setup. And one thing that a lot of people don't consider is if you're in the US, you need a 220 volts plug for both the air compressor and the plasma cutter most of the time. And if you're in Australia, you need both a 15 amp plug for both of the air compressor and the plasma cutter. We had to spend like $500 getting some plugs outside installed. Most plugs in Australia are 10 amp. So right off the bat, you're looking in the thousands of dollars for a plasma cutter setup. Another thing is air capacity. You're going to need a pretty big air compressor to run one of these, unless you want to make really short cuts. I think with my 60 liter air compressor at like 30 amps of one of these, I can only cut for like a minute or something. This is my much beloved 9-inch Bosch angle grinder. I've been using this for a couple of years now. These are machines, and you can both cut and grind with these, which is fantastic, not to mention the millions of other things you can do with an angle grinder. These retail for something like $200, and you can do pretty much anything with them. But in terms of cutting, you aren't really limited to what thickness of material you can cut. In fact, these are faster a lot of the time because of the slag that plasma cutters leave. I think once you cross the line of cutting about half an inch or 15 mil steel, that a plasma cutter becomes faster than an angle grinder in terms of cleanup to get the same finish, because plasma cutters leave dross on the bottom of the cut that needs to be cleaned off if you want to weld anything together, whereas angle grinders don't. With an angle grinder, it's also far easier to freehand a straight cut than a plasma cutter. You're going to need some serious skill to try and cut something remotely straight, or you need to set up a straight edge or a whiskey stick or something like that. Whereas one of these, it's because the blade's so large, it stays in the curve, making it really easy to cut straight lines with even a little bit of experience. Angle grinders also require almost no setup. I just pull this off the shelf and then I just plug the cord in and I'm off to cutting. It makes way more sense, in my opinion, to just get an angle grinder and cut things. Now, it's pretty difficult cutting anything but a straight line with an angle grinder. That's one advantage of a plasma cutter, but realistically, when are you ever going to cut something that's not a straight line? You might think you will, but in most fabrication or welding or anything like that, everything is made of straight lines. And even if it's not, you can always just make multiple straight cuts to cut a curved line. Plasma cutters also can't cut dimensional stock. What I mean by this is something like square tubing or pipes or anything like that. Whereas something like a cut-off saw can very easily. A plasma cutter is just not even close to being accurate enough to cut those things. With an angle grinder, it is a lot more difficult, but it is possible to cut things like square tubing with it if you cut on all four sides of it. But what about thicker stuff? Well, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I think oxyacetylene is a better option for hobbyists if you're only doing a reasonable amount of work anyway. Professionals use plasma cutters because they're cheaper to run than oxyacetylene. Oxyacetylene, because of all the gas you use, is more expensive to run, but it's far cheaper to buy. But if you're a hobbyist and you only cut a couple things every little while, then a plasma cutter is far more expensive, and I think you're just better off with oxyacetylene. In addition, oxyacetylene can be used for welding if you want to practice oxyacetylene welding, if you want to prepare for TIG welding. You can also heat things with oxyacetylene. You can, it's just such a useful setup. Whereas a plasma cutter does nothing but cut. This might not be an issue for you, but plasma cutters are way heavier than other options of cutting steel. With an oxyacetylene setup, occasionally it can be in a cart, so if you need to cut really thick steel, you can roll it anywhere. Whereas a plasma cutter weighs a lot to begin with. And not to mention trying to wheel around an air compressor. An angle grinder weighs almost nothing, and you can even carry it with one hand or put it in the back of a truck or anything like that. So plasma cutters are slower, don't leave as good of a finish, more expensive to run, more expensive to buy, heavier, take longer to set up, and overall just more of a pain in the ass to set up and to use than something like an angle grinder. If I were to take the time back, instead of getting an angle grinder, I'd either get an oxyacetylene setup, I'd buy another angle grinder, or I'd just buy that cut-off saw that I have now.
I wish I could take it back. I wish I could take it back, but it's too late.
In my opinion, plasma cutters are awesome tools and they have their place, but for most hobbyists, I wouldn't recommend them. If you've been doing this for a couple of years and you think it's time to step up your game, a plasma cutter might be a good option, but I've just warned you. And if it's one of those very rare times when you need to cut really thick steel, for instance in some sort of just emergency demolition project, you can always cut steel with a stick welder. If you are looking at getting a plasma cutter, I'd recommend getting at least a 50-liter tank air compressor, maybe with an upgraded motor on it or engine. You might want to look at getting a petrol or diesel powered air compressor, because it can be difficult running both an air compressor and a plasma cutter on the same circuit. Also, if you are to get a plasma cutter, I'd recommend getting a high quality one like this. Like I always say, buy once, cry once. Just spend the extra money now. Thanks very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like down below. If you have any questions, leave them down below. Maybe subscribe to the channel. Thanks a lot, guys. Love y'all. See ya.